Hi, everybody. We are going to talk about what is going on back in the States during World War One. So, what's going on inside our borders? Okay, so your objective for the end of this lesson should be, can you tell me how the Great War affected laws that were passed, that's domestic legislation, and how normal citizens reacted and moved around the country? All right, so the first thing we need to talk about is America mobilizing for war. Specifically, how do we go from a relatively small standing army to a huge force big enough to go fight in this war? And it was a very small army. At the beginning of World War One, our army was like a fraction of the size of what European armies were. And so we knew we needed to be able to get men quickly. So we did ask for volunteers, and we did get over 2 million volunteers signed up without needing a draft. Uh, but there still wasn't enough coming in. So they passed a law called the Selective Service Act. It is still around today, and it authorizes a draft. It allows Congress basically to call for a draft of United States citizens. At this point, it's male citizens. Um, in May of 1917, men are told they have to go and register, and you get a little draft card. It's got a number on it, and then they would post draft lists. And if the number on the draft list was the number on your card, you had to report to boot camp. So 24 million men registered for the draft. About 2.8 million are actually drafted. So a little bit more than 10% were drafted. Now, all said and done, about 4.8 million Americans served in the Great War. And of those 4.8 million, 4 of them were actually sent to serve overseas in some capacity. Now, not everyone's going to be happy with the idea of the draft. This is really constraining to people who have never seen a draft in their country before. One of the things that we had going for us that we used to brag about was that we didn't force our citizens to be in the military. Well, now we are, and a lot of people thought that the draft was illegal because it was intrusive. It was forcing men to serve in the military, whether or not they wanted to. And you're going to get about 12% of the men who received draft notices just never responded. They just pretended they never got it. Some of those are going to be conscientious objectors. Some of those just don't think the government has the right to draft them. Now, conscientious objectors were a little bit different. They were opposed to the war on either moral or religious grounds. So either their religion did not allow them to be part of a military, or they did not morally think it was right to go and kill people. Now, in theory, if these men were drafted, they could get a religious exemption, which would keep them from being put into combat services. But in practice, it's going to be widely ignored. There's a very strict set of rules on what counted as a religious exemption. For example, your church had to be a member of a recognized denomination. And it had to have been, the church had to have been around for a certain number of years. One of the most famous heroes of the war that we're going to talk about tomorrow, Alvin C. York. He was from Pall Mall, Tennessee, grew up like dirt grubbing poor. And he is a conscientious objector. He's one of those people that found religion late in his life. So he is going to be very strictly following what he considers the religious teachings of the Bible. Excuse my cell phone. And he does not believe that God wants people to go and shoot at others. He doesn't believe war is good. So he tries to get a religious exemption, and they don't allow him to. His church doesn't meet the criteria needed to be granted religious exemption status. So they draft Alvin C. York. And of course, he grew up in the backwoods hunting every day for his dinner, so he could shoot. And he becomes, known for his sharpshooting abilities. And he will eventually go on to win the Congressional Medal of Honor for single-handedly capturing over 60 Germans. He is credited with at least 12 kills in that saving attempt. And when they asked him why, if you're a conscientious objector, did you go and you kill those Germans? He took out a row of machine gun nests, is what he did. He said, I couldn't watch my friends die anymore, basically, is what he said. So life has to completely change in America. Everything has to flip. Everything has to go from being about capitalism and making money to being about supporting our boys in the war. And one of the organizations that sets about doing this is the War Industries Board, the WIB. It is headed by Bernard Baruch, and his job is to convince factories to stop producing whatever they were producing before the war and to start producing war-related goods. Tanks, ammunition, uniforms if you were a clothing factory, something that could be used to help the soldiers, to help the war effort. Now, it is important to note that this and every other type of war-related committee is going to be voluntary in World War I. We're going to ask very politely for businesses to please do this, and most of them do. You're seen as being unpatriotic if you don't. It's different in World War II. In World War II, all this stuff we're going to talk about, it's all mandatory. But in World War I, it's all voluntary. Keep that in the back of your mind. You have the Committee on Public Information, the CPI. This is George Creel is the head of it. Sometimes the Committee on Public Information is known as the Creel Committee. And his job is to educate the public on what is causing the war and how the war is going. So basically, his job is to create anti-German propaganda. What you see right there is one of the things that he created. It's got a German gorilla, right, with Lady Liberty about to be, burned, raped, and pillaged. It says, "Destroy this mad brute. Enlist in the U.S. Army." Okay. So it's anti-German propaganda is what he's trying to create here. A lot of this is going to help shape the public opinion. And you'll learn tomorrow, he actually does his job a little bit too well. But he basically, it creates propaganda, which are anything you use to change someone's opinion, to force people to see Germans as the bad guy and to get people to support the war effort. Another tactic he used were a group of young soldiers known as 4-Minute Men. They would take these very young, strapping Captain America looking, young soldiers, and they would train them in how to give a 4-minute long speech. And it was a rousing speech. It was to hell with the Germans, let's go kill them all and protect America and protect democracy and hurrah. It was one of those types of speeches. And it was really, really smart because when they trained them how to give this speech, it wasn't just the words. They taught them when to raise their voice. They taught them what words to stress. They taught them what facial expressions to use, what hand motions to use. So basically, they're taught on how to give a 4-minute long play, or like what we would consider a political commercial today, a 4-minute long political commercial about why this war is necessary and why men are needed to fight in it. And what these 4-minute men would do is they would travel across the country giving this speech. They gave the speech at state fairs, in high schools, and colleges. And what they do is they get the crowd all revved up for how, the Germans need to be, brought to heel, and we need to join the military, and we need to support our country. And then they would say, if you want to enlist, we've got the paperwork right back here at this table. Come and see me. And you're going to get a lot of men volunteering for the war because they're so hyped up from this speech, and they don't bother to go home and think about it or talk to their parents or talk to their wives or, figure out, how life is going to work if they're gone. They're so caught up in the moment, they enlist in the military. And it turns out that you can't go back the next day and tell the military, I changed my mind. I don't want to be a part of you anymore. That's not something they'll accept. So some of the propaganda the Creel Committee comes up with, you have the Uncle Sam there with the battered Lady Liberty, right? She's been beaten. It says, protect the nation's honor, enlist now. Okay. Or you've got the Lady Liberty who's sleeping, that Columbia who's sleeping. Wake up, America. Civilization calls every man, woman, and child. Okay. So this is not time to sit back and relax or sit back and sleep. It is time to get up and get involved in this war effort. The Food Administration, run by a guy named Herbert Hoover, who will go on to become president after this war later on down the road. Herbert Hoover in World War I, he has probably one of the hardest jobs any American has ever had. He has to convince Americans to willingly eat less food. Like, not for health reasons, not because it's better for you, just because we don't want you to, so eat less. And he does an amazing job of it. Like, it's amazing the amount he got done. He's going to use a lot of propaganda to do that. And he always equates it back to winning the war. Now, what they wanted people to eat less of was meat, wheat, and sugar, because you needed meat for the troops, right? You need it for rations to feed your troops. Wheat makes bread, which is what you want to send to the troops, and sugar is a preservative. So you can use sugar to keep things lasting longer. Okay. Plus, it's nice to send your soldiers, a little bit of a sugar ration in their ration box for their coffee in the morning. So he is trying to convince Americans to eat less of those things so that our soldiers, when they go overseas, will have those things to eat. And he comes up with the idea of meatless, wheatless, and sweetless days. He says, if you pick on your own, for your own family, if every family picks one day a week, and on that one day, they don't eat any meat, and then they pick a different day of the week, and on that one day, they can have meat, but they don't eat any wheat, no wheat at all. And so instead of wheat bread, you're eating cornbread, okay? No wheat at all. Or corn cakes, because you need flour for cornbread. Or, a different day of the week, you pick one day, no sugar, nothing with sugar in it. And if every American family did those three things, then there would be plenty of food to go to our soldiers. And a lot of families are going to be perfectly fine with doing that. They also try to convince Americans to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables, not canned fruits and vegetables. Because the canned food was already preserved, it would last longer, it would be better to send to the troops. So they tried to convince Americans to start their own gardens. They called them victory gardens. You could grow your own fruits and vegetables so that the cash crop farms who were growing the large amounts of vegetables, those can go to the canning facilities where they would be canned, and then the cans would be put into ration boxes. So some of the political cartoons you see, food, buy it with thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local foods, that's the fresh, serve just enough, so don't serve enough that people aren't going to be able to finish what's on their plate, and then use what is left. He's telling Americans to use the leftovers, okay? Don't throw away leftovers. Don't waste it. This one is geared towards immigrants. Okay, you've got Lady Liberty in the background. There's New York skyline. Okay, here's a boat. And then here's a group of immigrants. And it says, food will win the war. You came here seeking freedom. Now you must help to preserve it. Wheat is needed for the Allies. Waste nothing. Okay, so you came to this country. You want to prove you're a good American citizen. You do what we're asking you to do. You do what you need to do to protect American soldiers. Some more propaganda. Don't waste bread. Save 2 slices every day and defeat the U-boat. So if every family could eat, just like, if you can't cut out wheat entirely, just 2 less slices of bread a day. If every family did that, we'd have enough bread at least. They're going to use soldiers a lot in the propaganda. We are saving you, you save food. Well fed soldiers will win the war. There's a reason why there's a famous saying that says the army marches on its stomach. Hungry soldiers do not perform as well. They never have, they never will. One of the reasons why Genghis Khan was such a phenomenal war leader was he made sure his footmen, like his normal soldiers, were fed before he and the commanders were, because he understood that if he has a army that is not well fed, then they are not going to be able to march and be healthy and fight the way they need to. Okay. Americans, not all Americans are happy with this war. There are still a lot of isolationists. On top of isolationists, now you have people who are speaking out against the draft, trying to convince men either not to sign up for the draft when they turn 18, or if they've been drafted, not to show up for boot camp, not to actually respond to the draft summons. So the government's going to pass a couple of laws here. They are the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Now, the Espionage Act, espionage usually means spying. Okay. So very harsh penalties if they catch you spying for Germany. If they catch you in any way aiding or helping the enemy, harsh penalties for that. And here's the third one. This is the one that people didn't really always agree with in Espionage Act. They said that interfering with recruitment was the same thing as helping the enemy. If you tried to keep in any way the army from drafting or recruiting soldiers, then you were helping the enemy. That's what the Espionage Act said. The Sedition Act is going to be hated by newspapers everywhere. The Sedition Act made it a crime to say or write anything negative against the government. Anything. Didn't have to be war related. You said anything, not even like negative. If you said anything even critical about the government, just like, I really don't like that they're doing this one thing here, that could be considered treasonous under the Sedition Act. Okay. Sedition is trying to overthrow your country. So they are saying that by disagreeing with your government, it's the same thing as trying to overthrow it. So obviously this is going to have a conflict with the First Amendment, right? We have the freedom of speech, okay? And there's going to be a bunch of Supreme Court cases that come out after this. The first one you need to know comes about for the Espionage Act. It's Schenck v. the U.S. That's a German name. And it said Schenck basically got arrested for passing out anti-draft brochures. And Schenck had to go to jail because the Espionage Act says you can't do that. And the Supreme Court upheld that. They said that you cannot interfere with recruitment, that's allowed. Further cases down the road ruled that the Sedition Act was allowed. They said specifically in times of war, the federal government can limit your freedom of speech because the things you say might indirectly end up hurting a soldier down the road. So if you're talking bad about your government and you're talking bad about things they're doing, and you convince more people not to enlist, or you convince more people to stop, the meatless, sweetless days, whatever it is you're doing, if that causes either a manpower shortage or if that causes less food to be sent to the troops, you are hurting America. You are hurting our country and our troops, and that can't be allowed. Okay. And then the last thing we're going to talk about today is the Great Migration. There are two of these. The first wave happens right before, during, and right after World War I. And this is the mass movement of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North. So, and this one, and the first one, you have over 50,000 African Americans leaving the South. Most of them are sharecroppers, and they are going to be going north into war industry jobs that are now open. So you've got all of these new factories opening up, and they need workers. So African Americans are going to go north and take those jobs. Now that's going to lead to some racial hostility. You're going to get Black neighborhoods growing very, 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 very quickly. And they're going to start to push up against white neighborhoods, and that's going to lead to a lot of anger. Remember, racism was not an exclusively Southern thing. Okay, racism existed everywhere. Um, it was just more openly violent in the South. But in the North, people are still racist. They still have segregation. It's just de facto segregation instead of de jure. So there's no actual laws in the North that say you can't come here. It's just understood you can't come here. And it's going to lead to a lot of racial violence. We'll talk about the Chicago race riot that happens in 1919 in the next unit. But this is something you need to keep in the back of your mind that through this unit, through the 1920s unit, and a little bit into the 1930s unit, you're going to have this mass movement of African Americans up into the North.